Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Tuesday, December 21st, 2021. President Joe Biden urging caution but not panic as he outlines new steps to confront COVID-19 Omicron variant and the latest surge. Those steps include increased support for hospitals facing a potential wave of patients, access to free tests, and expanding capacity to get more Americans vaccinated. President also saying, with another urgent reminder to the unvaccinated, get the shots or worry about Omicron. Now, the Democratic Senator Joe Manchin has pulled his support from the $1.75 trillion Build Back Better social spending framework that had been under negotiations. What happens next? We'll talk with The Hill senior reporter Alex Bolton about possible hardball tactics to persuade Senator Manchin to jump on board. And Secretary of State Antony Blinken responding to the latest threat from Russia. Russia saying it could use force against Ukraine if it does not get security guarantees from Western nations. From the Associated Press, fighting the Omicron variant surging through the country, President Joe Biden announced Tuesday that the government would provide 500 million free rapid tests, increase support for hospitals under strain, and redouble vaccination and boosting efforts. At the White House on Tuesday, Biden detailed major changes to his COVID-19 winter plan, his hand forced by the arrival of the fast-spreading variant, whose properties are not yet fully understood by scientists. Yet his message was clear that the winter holidays could be close to normal for the vaccinated while potentially dangerous for the unvaccinated. This is from AP. It also goes on, his pleas are not political, he emphasized. He noted that former President Donald Trump has gotten his booster shot, and he said it's Americans' patriotic duty to get vaccinated. Here's the president.
How concerned should you be about Omicron, which is now the dominant variant in this country, and it happened so quickly? The answer is straightforward. If you're not fully vaccinated, you have good reason to be concerned. You're at a high risk of getting sick. And if you get sick, you're likely to spread it to others, including friends and family. The unvaccinated have a significantly higher risk of ending up in a hospital or even dying. Almost everyone who has died from COVID-19 in the past many months has been unvaccinated. Unvaccinated. But if you're among the majority of Americans who are fully vaccinated, and especially if you've gotten the booster shot, that third shot, you have much less reason to worry. You have a high degree of protection against severe illness. But because Omicron spreads so easily, we'll see some fully vaccinated people get COVID, potentially in large numbers. There will be positive cases in every office, even here in the White House among the vaccinated from Omicron. But these cases are highly unlikely to lead to serious illness. Vaccinated people who get COVID may get ill, but they're protected from severe illness and death. That's why you should still remain vigilant. According to our doctors, even if you're fully vaccinated, you should wear a mask when indoors and in public settings. Wearing a mask provides extra protection for you and those around you. And I know some Americans are wondering if you can safely celebrate the holidays with your family and friends. The answer is yes, you can. If you and those you celebrate with are vaccinated, particularly if you've gotten your booster shot. If you are vaccinated and follow the precautions that we all know well, you should feel comfortable celebrating Christmas and the holidays as you planned it.
President Biden at the White House. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention announcing on Monday that the Omicron variant is now the dominant strain in the U.S. of COVID-19, and it got that way in just a week, now accounting for about 73% of all the new cases. This has led to schools shifting to remote learning in many places, restaurants closing again to the public in some cities, and many public events being rescheduled. Here's more from the president and some details about those at-home COVID tests that the government will be buying and then giving away for free.
We also need to do better with at-home testing. So I'm announcing today the federal government will purchase 1/2 billion, that's not million, billion with a B, additional at-home rapid tests with delivery starting in January. We'll be getting these tests to Americans for free, and we'll have websites where you can get them delivered to your home. We've arranged for it to be easier for you to find a free COVID testing site near you on Google. Just enter COVID test near me in the Google search bar, and you can find a number of different locations nearby where you can get tested. We're going to continue to use the Defense Production Act, as we did earlier this month, to make sure we're producing as many tests and as quickly as possible.
President Joe Biden at the White House. More on the COVID-19 Omicron variant now with Dan Diamond, Washington Post health reporter. Thanks so much for being with us. Your reaction to what President Biden announced today, is it enough? Will it work?
There are a number of things that the president announced that advocates, health experts have wanted for a while. I think the challenge is they're arriving at a moment where it may be too late to fend off the Omicron variant. The need for testing has been clear for quite some time. The president's commitment to get 500 million more rapid tests in the hands of Americans by January, that's not going to do very much ahead of the holidays, where folks are looking in cities like New York and D.C. for access to tests that they can't find. The goal of scaling up support for hospitals, that's something else that advocates have really pushed for. The fear that hospital workers would be overwhelmed, not just by sick patients, but by sick coworkers who might not be able to work if they come down with the Omicron variant. So there are good things in this plan that people have pushed the White House on for weeks. The only issue is, why did it take until December 21 to get them?
And the president again emphasizing no more lockdowns. Is that okay, given what we're up against?
The president stressed we're not in March 2020, and he's right. We do have testing. We have vaccines and boosters that will let us know with the testing where outbreaks are, hopefully, and with the vaccines and boosters will defang those outbreaks. So it is a different situation. The idea of lockdowns was more politically palatable when we hadn't done any yet. At this point, bringing them back would be a very tough sell. And there's also less public health evidence for it if there are fewer people at risk. But there are still folks who could have a bad go with Omicron, people who are unvaccinated, who have immune conditions that prevent them from developing and keeping antibodies, and then other folks who may have gotten vaccinated months ago but have yet to get a booster shot.
You have written an article that's titled 5 Things About Omicron That I Want My Friends and Family to Know. What are some of those things?
Well, the first thing is that wasn't an article initially. It was just a Facebook post, but it got passed around so much that we turned it into an actual story at the Washington Post. One of those things is that for Omicron and its transmissibility, the vaccines, unfortunately, are not going to have the same protection that they had against other variants. The way that Omicron has mutated, it can dance around antibodies. The very simple way that I put it was, imagine bouncers in front of a club keeping people out, and Omicron comes in camouflage and just goes right past those bouncers and gets inside for many people. That doesn't mean that there aren't other layers of defense that can fight off infection. And in many cases, because people have been vaccinated, their immune systems will still have the tools to really suppress the Omicron infection. Some people might not even know they're infected. But it does mean that the vaccines themselves are not enough, especially if it's been months, to ward off this wave of Omicron cases.
Do your family and friends ever ask you when you think this is all going to end? And what do you tell them?
All the time. I ask myself that. I thought by now things would be back to more normal than they are, and that I've had to cut back in my personal life, things that I've been wanting to do and had been looking forward to doing just because I don't want to put family members at risk at the holidays. I think, unfortunately, that's the waxing and waning of fighting a new pandemic, a new virus that we don't know every twist and turn yet. So I'm hopeful that things are generally trending up. I can't put a decision date on when things will definitively be over.
Dan Diamond is a health reporter with The Washington Post. Find his work at WashingtonPost.com. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and stay safe.
President's announcement of those 500 million at-home tests to be given away, according to an AP article, marks a major shift for Biden, who earlier had called for many Americans to purchase the hard-to-find tests on their own and then seek reimbursement from their health insurance. White House Press Secretary Jensaki, during her regular briefing, asked by a reporter about an answer she gave on this a couple of weeks ago.
As A couple weeks ago, you stood here at the podium when there was a discussion about sending tests to people's homes, and you said, should we just send them to every American? As you've reflected on the change in Omicron here, have you reflected on your tone in that answer?
Well, Jeff, I would say there's not a day that goes by that I don't leave this podium and wish I would have said something with greater context or more precision or additional information. And that day there was a lot of good questioning on testing, and during that briefing I conveyed a lot of information about our expansion of testing, about the 50 million tests that we were making available, about the 20,000 free testing sites. And should I have included that additional context again in that answer? Yes, going back, I wish I would have done that. To be clear, so people have accurate information about how it works out there, which I know is your objective as well as mine, we're making tests free and accessible without the risk of them going to waste in the home of people who do not want them. So people will go to a website, which again we will put out there in January when the information is available, and they will be able to request free tests. That's something that is a reflection of the President's commitment to continue re-examining and improving our COVID response, including as it relates to testing.
The White House Press Secretary Jensaki with reporters in the White House briefing room. President announcing that the federal government will be supplementing state hospitals prepared to deploy an additional 1,000 troops with medical skills to help hospitals that are having trouble under the surge of patients from the Omicron variant. Also, the administration immediately sending federal medical personnel to specific states that are hard hit: Michigan, Indiana, Wisconsin, Arizona, New Hampshire, and Vermont among them. Well, a number of state governors have been calling out the National Guard as well in recent weeks. Today, this from NBC Boston. Governor Charlie Baker announcing he's activating up to 500 members of the National Guard to assist hospitals with the COVID-19 surge and updating the state's mask advisory. Governor Baker held a news conference.
The Massachusetts National Guard is also due a tremendous thank you. From getting kids to school to protecting small businesses to now helping our healthcare providers, these citizen soldiers answer every call. The jobs and commitments they leave to serve us are real, and we're deeply grateful for it. There's no question the next few weeks will be enormously difficult for our healthcare community. There are staff shortages, sicker patients, and fewer step-down beds available, again, because of those staff shortages. The steps we're announcing today are designed to support them so that they can continue to care for patients. We also know there's some anxiety out there with talk of rising cases, breakthrough cases, and variants. Throughout the course of this pandemic, there's been no shortage of hypotheticals, no shortage of worst-case scenarios to be debated, and no shortage of things we don't yet know the answer to. And it's very easy to get lost in all that. It's also easy to get anxious about all that. But it's critically important that we also remember what we do know for sure. We know that kids are at extremely low risk, and we know that going to school is safe, and in many cases, it's also healthy for children to be with each other and with trained, caring adults. We know vaccines work. We know that out of the 5 million people in Massachusetts who are fully vaccinated, only 2% have gotten COVID. We know that among all the breakthrough cases in Massachusetts, 97% of them never end up in a hospital. And we know that of the 1.2 million people over the age of 12 and under the age of 30 who've got vaccinated, not one has died from COVID. We know that of the nearly 2.5 million people under the age of 60, less than 1% of these people, in fact, 0.1% of them have died from COVID. And we know for those over 60 who got vaccinated, less than 3% of them have died from COVID. And we also know that almost 2 million people in Massachusetts have already received a third dose. We also know that unvaccinated people are 31 times more likely to just test positive than someone with that third dose. We also know that the vast majority of the people in the hospital with COVID are not vaccinated. All that means, among other things, is that we know for sure that vaccines offer tremendous protection from illness, better than any other measure.
It's Governor Charlie Baker, Republican from Massachusetts, with that announcement today. This month, the governors of Maine, Ohio, and New York also deploying the National Guard in response to dangerously low capacity at statewide medical facilities due to the coronavirus pandemic. Some other COVID news: Attorney General Merrick Garland announcing the Justice Department would allow some prisoners who were released to home confinement during the pandemic to stay out of prison, reverses a legal stance adopted in the last days of the Trump administration. Garland writing, thousands of people on home confinement have reconnected with their families, have found gainful employment, and have followed the rules. We will exercise our authority so that those who have made rehabilitative progress and complied with the conditions of home confinement and who, in the interest of justice, should be given an opportunity to continue transitioning back to society are not unnecessarily returned to prison. And the Census Bureau reporting the U.S. population growth fell to its lowest rate since the founding of the United States during the first year of the pandemic, as the coronavirus cut back immigration, delayed pregnancies, and, of course, killed hundreds of thousands of U.S. residents. The United States grew by only 0.1%. That's just under 400,000 people added between July 2020 and July 2021. It's the first time since 1937 the nation's population grew in a year by less than 1 million. On Wall Street, the Dow with a rebound up 560 today. Nasdaq up 360. S&P up 81. This from Reuters. President Joe Biden said on Tuesday that he and conservative Democratic Senator Joe Manchin were, quote, going to get something done on the president's proposed social spending legislation. Biden telling reporters when asked about Manchin, who had publicly rejected the president's Build Back Better plan on Sunday in a move that imperils legislation, Senator Manchin and I are going to get something done. Here's the question and the answer to the president at the White House.
About the importance of keeping your word of trust. Do you believe Senator Manchin kept his word to you? And how do you rebuild trust with progressives in your party to advance your legislation now?
You know, I told you before, you've heard me say this before, some people think maybe I'm not Irish because they don't hold a grudge. Look, I want to get things done. I still think there's a possibility of getting Build Back Better done. And what I don't want to do is get into, and Joe went on TV today, and I don't know whether it's TV or not, I'm told he was speaking to the liberal caucus in the House and said, Joe Biden didn't mislead you, I misled you. And so, look, I'm not looking for, let me say something. You saw what happened yesterday. All the talk about how my Build Back Better plan was going to increase inflation, going to cause these debts and all the like. What happened? Goldman Sachs and others said, if we don't pass Build Back Better, we're in trouble because it's going to grow the economy. And without it, we're not going to grow. And what happened? Stock prices went way down. It took a real dip. If you take a look, everybody thinks because I quoted 17 Nobel laureates saying this is going to help inflation. Think about it in terms of you're a hard-working person and you're making 60 grand if you're alone, or if you're a mom or just on her own, or if you're making 80 grand, mom and dad 90 grand like a lot of people do, and you're worried about inflation, you should be worried about it because it's a devastating thing for people who are working class and middle class folks. It really hurts. Where is most of the cost now? The cost is finding in gasoline, even though I was able to bring it down 12 cents a gallon, will come down more, I believe. We talked about what the cost in food prices going up, et cetera. But look what's in Build Back Better. Child care. You can reduce it by up to 70%. That'll be the difference between 20 million women who aren't back in the workforce being able to go back if you pass it. We're talking about health care, insulin. In a situation, we got 200,000 kids with type 1 diabetes. You know what it's costing? It cost somewhere between 10 cents and $10 to come up with the formula, okay, a while ago, right? You know what it's costing on average? $640 a month. up to $1,000 a month. What do you do if you're a mom and a dad working with minimum wage, busting your neck? You look at your kid, and you know if you don't get that vaccine for him, if you don't get that drug for him, if you don't get be able to take that, what happens? They're likely to go in a coma, maybe die. Not only do you put the kid's life at stake, you strip away all the dignity of a parent looking at their child.
The Hill senior reporter Alex Bolton writes that Senate Democrats are signaling they plan to take a more hardball approach to pressuring Senator Joe Manchin to support their climate and social spending agenda after months of kid glove treatment failed to deliver his vote. Alex Bolton joins us now. Thank you. What does hardball mean?
Well, hardball means making the case publicly that there are many things in the Build Back Better Act that would really help a low-income state like West Virginia, whether it's expanded Medicare benefits or federal subsidies for child care or an expansion of the enhanced child care tax credit. They say there is a lot in here for West Virginia, and they're calling Manchin out on his argument or his defense that he's representing the interests of West Virginia. Democrats are challenging him, saying, no, you're not representing the interests of West Virginia. In fact, you're going against the interests of your home state. Now those are fighting words in the collegial Senate, where you don't talk about what's best for someone else's constituents. That's stuff that isn't taken kindly to, and Democrats have really resisted, confronting Manchin in this policy debate because they were worried that they weren't going to get his vote. Well, after Manchin made clear on Fox News Sunday that he is going to be a no on Build Back Better, I think the Democrats are going to turn to more pressure tactics, and we're seeing it already. The statement from White House Press Secretary Jensaki on Sunday said that Manchin needs to explain to people who are paying a lot of money for insulin and who can't go back to work because they have child care responsibilities why he's opposing this bill. And Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer says, we're going to vote on this until we get it done. He's suggesting potential multiple votes, forcing Manchin to take to the floor to vote against these priorities. That is a strategy that Schumer just a few days ago had rejected. He didn't want to have a floor fight with Manchin, but at least in a Dear Colleague letter circulated on Monday, Schumer's indicating to colleagues he's ready for that floor fight.
You mentioned their fighting words. What are the risks of playing hardball with a Democratic senator from a state like West Virginia that often votes overwhelmingly Republican?
The biggest risk is that Manchin switches parties. And, that's something that's been, talked about for years now. Will or will he not, think about switching to the GOP? Texas Senator John Cornyn just said that he urged Joe Manchin in a text message to join the GOP. I mean, there are periodic conversations between Senate Republicans and Manchin. They're feeling him out, seeing whether he will come over to their caucus. Now, Manchin has ruled out that option in the past, but when he was asked Monday in an interview with Happy Kirchhoff if there's still room for him in the Democratic Party, Manchin was certainly wasn't definitive. He said, well, I hope there are Democrats like me, but on the other hand, he has kind of complained this year that the Democrats aren't very centrist anymore, and that they've become kind of dominated by the liberal wing. So Manchin that he did not rule it out when asked most recently. So that's the biggest risk. Although I think it's seen as generally pretty remote that he would become a Republican or an independent who caucuses with Republicans.
Senator Manchin also saying on that Happy Kirchhoff show that it was White House staff leaks that undermined the negotiations. I guess that's another risk of playing hardball. He is not going to respond well to a tactic like that.
Yeah, and that's where we saw the beginning of the hardball. It was leaked from the White House last week that Manchin wanted to pull the one-year extension of the enhanced child credit out of the bill. When that leaked, Manchin was furious, and he actually was berating reporters last week, saying, this is bull. You know the rest of the word. Saying he was beside himself with frustration and anger, that this had leaked. And he mentioned it on the Hoppy Kercheval show on Monday that, he didn't specify exactly what it was, but he said that, the White House knows what they did. And I think he's referring to that leak on the child tax credit. The reason why that was so damaging is because that is such a high priority for many Democrats. And, when word got out that Manchin wanted to pull it out of the bill, there was some pretty intense pushback and criticism of him from fellow Democrats. And I think that's why it was kind of certainly was a hardball move, and it was one that Manchin didn't appreciate. Did it backfire? Well, too soon to say, because certainly, it has hastened the action. It has kind of forced Manchin to come out and say he's a no on this bill and at least put his cards on the table. And I think what was so frustrating for the White House and other Democrats is that, Manchin was just, not really taking a position publicly. He just kept on, kicking the can down the road and saying, well, we're talking, but nothing was getting done.
We're talking with Alex Bolton from The Hill. So Senator Chuck Schumer, the majority leader, said that he will be forcing at least one vote when they come back from the holiday recess. What happens after that? Do they put together some scaled-down version, perhaps, to try to pass?
Well, I think it's interesting to see whether that will actually happen. I know that Schumer, recently, he'd been pressed by members of his caucus, just put it on the floor and force Manchin to vote. Schumer is, I think, reluctant to do that because if you do that and the bill fails, it's going to get some bad headlines. It's going to be embarrassing, and he's the majority leader, so the buck stops with him. He kind of would get the blame for that, even though it's clear, what's going to happen. So we'll see whether he actually does force, Manchin's hand. I can expect him to try to find a way to avoid, some floor conflict like that. But we'll see. If it does happen, then look, it's back to the drawing board. Okay, this can't pass, and maybe Schumer wants to, send a message to, his progressive colleagues, say, let's see, we can't get all your priorities in this bill. We need to pare it down. And so they go back to the drawing board. They negotiate, a slimmed down package focused on a few things. What's going to be in it, we'll see. Climate is a very big priority for many Democrats, but of course Manchin comes from a coal state and is quite hostile to some of the reforms that have been proposed. Manchin has talked about a 10-year extension of the child tax credit. That's $1.5 trillion. That would be a big accomplishment. Maybe Democrats, build a package around that. But a lot of stuff will have to go. And now I think the next phase is it's going to be a battle, intra-party battle amongst the Democrats as to, what stays on the table and what gets knocked off.
Alex Bolton is a senior reporter with The Hill. Find his story at thehill.com. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
And the White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki suggesting today President Biden could extend a freeze on student loan payments and accrued interest, which has been in place during the pandemic. During her briefing at the White House with reporters, she said that the president has not yet decided whether he'll allow millions of Americans to forego those student loan payments at no additional cost beyond the current deadline when the payments would kick back in, and that's the end of January, start of February. Washington Today continues in a minute.
Sunday, January 2nd, on InDepth, Civil War historian Alan Gelzo joins us live to talk about the early intellectual history of the United States, the Civil War, and the Reconstruction era. His book titles include Redeeming the Great Emancipator, Gettysburg, and his latest, Robert E. Lee, A Life, a biography of the Confederate general in the Civil War. Join in the conversation with your phone calls, Facebook comments, texts, and tweets for Alan Gelzo. Sunday, January 2nd, at noon Eastern on InDepth on Book TV.
And welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the C-SPAN Now app and wherever you get your podcasts. A few more headlines. The Federal Aviation Administration saying passengers who face fines for unruly behavior could lose their Transportation Security Administration pre-check privileges, which speeds up the pre-boarding security screening. FAA Administrator Steve Dixon saying if you act out of line, you will wait in line. And on the January 6th attack on the Capitol, House Select Committee investigating it. A couple of updates. Congressman Scott Perry, Republican of Pennsylvania, officially saying no to a request for him to sit for an interview and turn over documents to the panel. He tweeted, "I stand with immense respect for our Constitution, the rule of law, and the Americans I represent who know that this entity is illegitimate and not duly constituted under the rules of the U.S. House." Associated Press notes the lawmakers' refusal will test how far the committee is willing to go in its quest for information, as members have so far resisted subpoenaing one of their own. And former President Donald Trump announcing he'll be holding a news conference on January 6th, the anniversary of the attack, from his private club in Mar-a-Lago, Florida. In his announcement, he also again falsely claims that the 2020 election was stolen from him. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has said her office is planning a series of events to mark the anniversary, including a prayerful vigil and discussion among historians. News from RT, funded by the Russian government, reports that Russian President Vladimir Putin has said that hopes for a deal with Washington to limit NATO expansion in Eastern Europe are slim, arguing that even a signed agreement could be torn up by the American side at a moment's notice. In a speech to his country's most senior military officers on Tuesday, Putin said he no longer viewed the West as a dependable partner. That was from RT. Russia has, in recent weeks, amassed about 100,000 troops near the Ukrainian border. Here's part of the speech that Putin gave through an interpreter.
We're not asking for any exclusive terms. Russia calls for indivisible, equitable security in Eurasia. But if our Western counterparts continue to push with an aggressive stance, we'll take military and technical action. We have the full right to respond to any unfriendly steps. We would like to protect our sovereignty and our defense.
Russian President Vladimir Putin through an interpreter in Moscow. In Washington, D.C., at the State Department, the Secretary of State Antony Blinken holding a news conference, and a question about U.S.-Russian relations from NBC reporter Andrea Mitchell.
Russia is increasing its demands on NATO. Today, the defense minister is saying that U.S. mercenaries are plotting a provocation in the Donbass, which some would say could be a pretext for some sort of invasion. The question is, since the president talked to President Putin, it seems as though the buildup is continuing, the threats are continuing from Vladimir Putin. So, at this point, how do you counter the Russian aggression? Are you concerned about something that would be less than a military invasion, that in some sort of a gray area where it might be more difficult? What would the U.S. response to that be in the Donbass, for instance? And there were reports that the U.S. and the U.K. are on high alert for a potential Russian cyber attack on critical infrastructure in Ukraine, which has happened in previous years during the holiday season, to either weaken the Zelensky government as a predicate before an invasion, or as an alternative to a military, a kinetic attack, which would be harder to retaliate against. So the bottom line is, how is diplomacy going to deal with this increasing Russian threat, which doesn't seem to be minimized at all by the talks, by the presidential talks? And
Andrea,
the threats.
we're engaged in diplomacy and deterrence at the same time. These two things go hand in hand. As you know, just to step back for a second, President Biden, when he first met with President Putin in Geneva some months ago, and you were there, said to President Putin that our strong preference is for a more predictable and stable relationship between Russia and the United States. But if Russia continues to engage in reckless or aggressive actions, we will respond, and we'll respond strongly. Since then, we've seen this build up again around Ukraine. That is of deep concern, not just to us, but to allies and partners in Europe and beyond. And we've seen plans that Russia has to commit renewed acts of aggression against Ukraine that it could implement on very short order. And so we've done two things. We have worked in very close coordination with allies and partners, not only to show the shared concern, but to put in place what would be a very meaningful and massive response if Russia commits renewed acts of aggressions. We've seen, and I think you've seen, statements coming out of NATO, the European Union, the G7, all making clear that there would be massive consequences. That's the language used, massive consequences for Russia if it engages in further acts of aggression against Ukraine. At the same time, President Biden's made clear that there's a much better path, and that is diplomacy. And we're committed to engaging in that if Russia is too. And to that end, President spoke to President Putin, as you know, a couple of weeks ago by video conference. There were follow-on conversations, notably between the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and his Russian counterpart. And as the White House noted yesterday, we have said, and Russia has also said, that we're prepared to engage diplomatically through multiple channels. The existing strategic stability dialogue that we have with Russia, between Russia and the United States, through the NATO-Russia Council on issues of particular concern to NATO, and through the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, that has as its members, among others, all of our European allies and partners, Ukraine, the United States, and Russia. And I think you'll see relatively early in the new year engagements in all of those areas to see if we can advance the differences diplomatically. Russia has said, and it put out some papers on this, that it has grievances, demands, concerns. Well, so does the United States and all of our European partners about Russia's conduct, the actions it's taken. All of that will be on the table. And if we can make our way forward diplomatically, that is far preferable. Last thing I'll say on this is that in all of this, we are in absolute solidarity, coordination, consultation with allies and partners. We are doing nothing about them, without them. All of this is being done together, and we'll see which direction President Putin wants to take.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken, part of his news conference today at the State Department in Washington. Earlier, the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, Karen Donfried, telling reporters that bilateral talks between the U.S. and Russia on Russia's security demands are expected to begin in January, but no specific date has been chosen yet. The time left to revive the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran is running out and raising the risk of an escalating crisis. The United States Special Envoy for Iran, Rob Malley, telling CNN. Malley is indirectly negotiating with Iran a return to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, formal name of the agreement, JCPOA. On Friday, the seventh round of nuclear talks between Iran and the remaining parties of that agreement ended in Vienna, with little visible movement toward a new agreement. Ron Dermer was Israeli ambassador to the United States 2013 through 21. Today, he talked about Iran and the nuclear program it has and the JCPOA, an event hosted by the Jewish Institute for National Security of America.
They have this belief that the worst possible scenario that you could have is a military confrontation with Iran. And because of that, that's what led to the JCPOA, and that's what the JCPOA looks the way that it did. Now, by the way, if you're in containment, if your policy is containment, to try to delay this for 10, 15 years in the hope that maybe something good will happen in the interim, the JCPOA is not such a bad deal if your policy is containment. If your policy is prevention, it's a disaster because you've ceded it to them. You just basically said, okay, so maybe we'll prevent them from having a bomb in this decade, but we're guaranteeing that they're going to have a nuclear arsenal in the next decade. You've ceded and you've decided that containment is, that prevention is not your policy and you're moving to containment. So what's happening now with Iran, it doesn't surprise me at all because all they're trying to do is avoid a potential military confrontation. I don't see a plan B at all. Because for them, a military confrontation is a bad outcome. And what you saw in the New York Times, those reports that came out recently that suggested that all of Israel's actions, supposed action, alleged actions, didn't really stop, the program, and they were actually counterproductive. And that's of a piece with the idea, which is the governing idea, that a military confrontation with Iran doesn't achieve our outcomes, doesn't achieve a positive outcome that we're looking for. It's the same mindset that leads you to believe that all this alleged activity that Israel did actually was counterproductive, which I think is absurd. I mean, had Israel and the United States not done actions over the last 20 years, sometimes separately, sometimes together, sometimes backed by the United, sometimes despite U.S. policy, Iran would have had a military nuclear capability a long time ago. So while those actions didn't solve the problem, it didn't dismantle that capability, it did postpone it. And it did work to postpone it. Again, the U.S. does not think that a military confrontation with Iran is a better outcome than a nuclear-armed Iran. And that's why I think we're in this loop that you're in, which is no good scenario is coming out of this, because either you're returning to a very bad deal that is a glide path to nuclear weapons, or you do nothing to confront them and you allow them to get closer and closer to really a potential breakout.
Ron Dermer is former Israeli ambassador to the United States at a virtual program today hosted by the Jewish Institute for National Security of America. Today is the 33rd anniversary of the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland, a bombing that killed 270 people. That's 243 passengers, 16 crew, and 11 residents on the ground. Among the 270, 190 Americans, including 35 Syracuse University students returning from studying abroad. This was the BBC TV news flash that day.
Before our next programme, we're going over to the newsroom and Nicholas Witchell.
Good evening. There's been a major air crash tonight near the Scottish border. A Pan-American jumbo jet carrying more than 250 people has crashed near the town of Lockerbie in Dumfries. The flight number 103 was en route from London Heathrow to John F. Kennedy Airport, New York. Eyewitnesses in Lockerbie say the aircraft crashed near a petrol station. There was a huge ball of fire. Local hospitals have been told to prepare for many casualties. We will have more details on the 9 o'clock news now on BBC One, and we will, of course, bring you more details on both BBC channels as we receive them.
And there'll be more news throughout the evening on that story on CFAX, page 298.
And that was from December 21st, 1988, 33 years ago today. Over the years, 2 Libyan men were tried for the bombing, 1 convicted. And then last year, in 2020, U.S. Attorney General William Barr announcing charges against a 3rd suspect, the alleged Libyan bomb maker. Today, the U.S. National Security Council spokesperson Emily Horn putting out a statement. It reads in part, "As we honor the victims of Pan Am Flight 103, we thank our Scottish partners for their continued pursuit of justice, and we remember the families and friends who have continued fighting for the loved ones they lost. Their courage and dedication remind us that there is no room in this world for terror of any kind, and that we must all remain persistent and vigilant in combating these evils together." Thanks for listening to Washington Today. For more top Washington stories, subscribe to C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word. Just go to c-span.org/connect to subscribe. I hope you have a good night.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal. Every day we take your calls live on the air on the news of the day, and we discuss policy issues that impact you. Coming up Wednesday morning, Nazanin Ash, CEO of the nonprofit Welcome.us, discusses her group's efforts to engage and mobilize all Americans to welcome and support refugees from Afghanistan. And then New York Times editorial board member Farrah Stockman talks about her book, American Made: What Happens to People When Work Disappears. Watch Washington Journal live at 7 Eastern Wednesday morning on C-SPAN or on C-SPAN Now, our new mobile app. Join the discussion with your phone calls, Facebook comments, texts, and tweets.